What if the person you trusted most, the mother of your children, turned betrayal into theater and then ended up in jail? This is not just a story about cheating, it's a story about survival, justice, and freedom. Today on Cheating Stories 7, we dive into a shocking tale. She cheated, she went to jail, now my ex-wife cries for my forgiveness. Stay with us until the end because the twists in this story will leave you stunned. And if you want more powerful true stories like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's step into this gripping story together. I once believed that marriages collapse with spectacle, a door ripped off its hinges, or a confession detonating in the kitchen light. But ours failed by degrees so subtle you could mistake them for changes in the weather. The first fracture was money. Marissa loved velocity more than balance. A second car gleaming in the driveway, a credit card humming at checkout, weekends booked because the discount would never come again. I told myself she was brave where I was cautious. Then the statements arrived like winter, cold, relentless, impossible to ignore. Contempt is light, it travels easily. It slipped in through the smallest habits. I lined receipts neatly on the table. She dismissed it as a hobby for boring men. I stacked the dishwasher carefully. She closed it with her hip and said it would figure itself out. When I tried to plan, she claimed plans were for people afraid of life. And when I asked for space to breathe, she accused me of making everything about myself. She never called me a bad man. Instead, she painted me as insufficient for the life she craved, a life that never balanced on paper but always glowed in her tone. The first thing she threw was a slow cooker, an object designed for patience. It left a bruise in the drywall and a quiet in my chest. I did not shout. I cataloged the arc, the cord trailing like a snake, the vibration under my feet when it landed. My father once said that rage burns the room down while calm preserves the furniture. But I discovered a darker truth. Sometimes calm is how you bleed out silently, calling it composure while the wound deepens. We built rituals to survive the storm. I woke the children, 6 in a row like rising suns. I packed lunches, tied shoes, wiped faces, kissed crowns, stirred oatmeal. When she worked late shifts at the coffee shop, I called it teamwork. She came home glowing with a citrus perfume that had no place in our bathroom cabinet. She said it was a new cleaner. I nodded because okay is what you say when trust is not yet a court case. At dinner, her phone lay face down until a new habit formed, the screen tilting away whenever a name lit up, her thumb shielding notifications like a small animal she refused to share. Arguments became choreography. I would ask for a budget, for rest, for even the smallest promise. She would smirk, repeat my words in a mocking voice. Listen to me. Like I was a parody of a husband in a sitcom nobody respected. Sometimes she went quiet and I mistook it for peace. Other times she calibrated her volume with precision, loud enough for the children to hear but never enough for scandal. When I lifted my hands to shield my ribs from a flying controller, she shouted, "Don't touch me," loud enough for the kids to hear from the hallway. I stopped trying to win. I just wanted to be seen. "I am not your enemy," I told her once, steady and calm. "I want a version of us that costs less than everything." She looked at me as if I had asked for extra credit. "You are boring," she said, and the word landed harder than any object could. Boring is what you call a man right before you shop for an exit. At night, after the kitchen closed and the laundry breathed heat into the hall, I scribbled numbers on scrap paper. Debt is its own language, one couples invent when they are afraid to speak the truth. Each line told the same story, more out than in, more wanting than care. I drafted budgets like maps to a destination she refused to visit. She never asked about the maps. She only asked why the air felt heavy in our home. I said it was because we were carrying it. There were soft hours, too. A toddler asleep on my chest while a game murmured on the TV. A line from a show that made her laugh until she had to stand up to breathe. The garden in our rental pushing up tomatoes like lanterns. Memory is unfair. It keeps the soft but also sharpens the blades. The soft moments kept me. I called it loyalty. Now I think it was a way of staying asleep while standing. The night before everything broke, she studied a lemon at the sink, peeling a ribbon the length of her arm. The scent was sharp, expensive, alive. She said the shop had started using it on the counters. I nodded, stacking plates, while my mind took a photograph of nothing in particular. Her profile in dull light, steam rising behind her, the red score on her thumbnail where the rind had fought back. And then came the thought I could not dismiss. What if this wasn't weather at all? What if this was rehearsal? What if the storm had a name and a schedule I was never invited to see? I don't remember the exact moment when suspicion became a voice. I only know that when it spoke, I recognized it as my own. It said choose the ordinary over spectacle. Protect the children. Stop calling chaos a personality. Start calling it a problem. That night when I turned off the light, the room felt larger, as though the walls themselves had stepped back to give the truth space to breathe. I did not sleep. I lay awake, watching the curtains stir in a private wind, waiting for morning to admit what I already knew. The crack was no longer a metaphor. It was a line I would have to cross. After the slow cooker left its mark on the wall, after nights of budgets I drafted like prayers she refused to answer, I told myself things would settle. Storms end, don't they? But instead of calm, a new routine began, one that looked practical on paper and poisoned everything in practice. Marissa offered to take evening shifts at the coffee shop. It sounded like sacrifice. She would work while I stayed home with the kids, saving us from the crushing cost of daycare. On paper, it was teamwork. In reality, paper doesn't carry scent, and the first warning didn't arrive as numbers or bruises. It arrived as fragrance. One night, close to midnight, she pushed through the front door, coat damp with drizzle. I reached for her bag to help, and the air shifted. A perfume clung to her collar, bright, citrus, foreign. It was not the detergent we used, nor the soap in our bathroom. It was alive in the way secrets are alive. When I asked, she smiled too quickly. The shop changed cleaners, she said, tossing her apron into the laundry. Her hands moved too fast, as though speed could erase suspicion. I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted the hours she worked to mean sacrifice, not betrayal. I let her answer stand because that is what trust does at first, it pretends. But the perfume returned again and again. Each time it came paired with a distracted grin, with her phone lighting as she angled the screen away. At night, I watched the glow of the device carve her face into two halves, light for whoever messaged her, shadow for me. When I leaned closer, she tilted the screen, thumb darting to shield the words as if they were fragile animals I wasn't allowed to touch. I asked once. She whispered, work stress, then kissed me too quickly. I accepted, because marriages are built not only on trust, but on the habit of pretending trust still exists. Her twin sister soon became part of the act. On family calls, she would explain why Marissa couldn't speak, her tone rehearsed like lines from a play. She's exhausted from work, she fell asleep early. Thin excuses, flimsy as curtains that don't quite meet in the middle. I swallowed them because the alternative meant facing what I already knew. Doubt is poison. It seeped into every silence. At dinner, when her screen tilted away. At night, when her laughter bloomed at a message no one else could see. I told myself suspicion was unfair, that accusing her without proof would make me the villain. So I swallowed it one drop at a time until my chest was heavy with toxins. I remember one evening with cruel clarity. She stumbled through the door close to midnight, cheeks flushed, fingers trembling as she dropped her keys. Long shift, she muttered, already moving past me. But then the phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, and the smile that crossed her lips was guarded, secretive, intimate in a way she hadn't been with me for months. That night I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathe beside me. For the first time, I did not feel like her partner. I felt like a placeholder, someone keeping the bed warm until her real life began elsewhere. The citrus perfume lingered on the pillow between us, a ghost of a world I had not been invited to. And in the dark, I understood this was not weather. This was rehearsal. The storm was gathering, and it already had a name. Arguments had always lived in our house like weather, sometimes passing, sometimes breaking glass. But after those midnight shifts began, the atmosphere changed. Marissa no longer argued to solve anything. She argued to win or perhaps just to wound. I would sit across the table, bills spread like evidence in front of me, asking how we could cover rent when she kept taking advances on her paycheck. She didn't answer. Instead, she pitched her voice high, mocking, dragging out my words as if I were a bad actor repeating lines no one wanted to hear. "How are we going to cover rent, Marissa?" Then she laughed, hollow, cruel, and I realized the money wasn't the issue anymore. The game was about humiliation. When I asked her to stop turning every disagreement into theater, she leaned back, arms crossed, a smirk stretching across her face. "You're too sensitive. No wonder nobody listens to you." The fight had shifted. It wasn't about groceries or rent. It was about my worth as a man, as a father, as a partner. The pattern hardened like routine. I would raise questions about the kids, about schedules, about her late nights that stretched into the early hours. She would turn every concern into an accusation. I was controlling, paranoid, boring. Words she had never used before now landed like darts, useless, suffocating, pathetic. These weren't bursts of anger. They were strategies. Each insult stripped away footing until I no longer remembered what the original question had been. And I began to notice something darker, satisfaction. She wasn't simply lashing out. She was feeding on my restraint, finding triumph in my silence. If I raised my voice, her eyes widened theatrically and she whispered, "See, you're scary." If I stayed calm, she rolled her eyes and muttered that I had nothing inside me worth fighting for. Either way, the verdict was the same. I lost. One evening, the play turned vicious. Her phone had been buzzing beneath a pillow for nearly an hour. I asked whose messages were waiting. She grabbed it before I could touch it, clutching it to her chest like it was oxygen. "Why do you always assume the worst?" she snapped. "I don't assume," I said, steady. "I notice." Her face twisted, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the truth beneath. Then she delivered the line that cut deeper than any thrown object. "I wish I had cheated already." The words hung in the air, sharp as broken glass. The kids were asleep upstairs. The refrigerator hummed. Her chest rose and fell with a strange relief, as if she had rehearsed this moment for months. She didn't take it back. She didn't soften it. She stared at me, daring me to react. Heat rushed to my ears. My vision narrowed. Every instinct told me to shout, to slam a fist, to demand the truth. But I forced my hands flat against the table. "Then maybe you already have," I whispered. For a flicker, her smile faltered, just long enough to confirm what my gut already knew. The thought hadn't been hypothetical. It had been memory, or at the very least, intent. From that night forward, every argument felt like a courtroom drama with a sentence already written. She wasn't speaking to me. She was performing for some invisible jury, imaginary witnesses she wanted to believe her version of events. I was no longer a husband. I was a defendant, standing trial in my own home. And beneath the shouting, beneath the laughter and the mocking, I began to hear something else. The sound of a door slowly closing, insult by insult, shutting me out of the life I thought we shared. I stopped asking how to fix things. I stopped hoping for answers. Instead, I became a witness, watching the game unfold, realizing with painful clarity that she had no intention of stopping. The marriage wasn't simply strained. It had turned into theater, and I was trapped in the audience, forced to watch the performance of my own downfall. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday night, the kind of evening that should have been harmless. The kids were asleep, their small breath steady through the baby monitors. The dishes were stacked, the house quiet in that way it only was after bedtime. Marissa had left her phone charging on the couch, a small oversight in a house where she had become obsessively careful about her devices. I told myself I was only picking it up to silence the constant vibration, to protect the children's sleep. But when the screen lit, there was no folder where one should have been, only a calculator icon, innocent enough except this calculator asked for a passcode. My chest tightened, fingers trembling. I tried her birthday. The screen unlocked and everything I thought I knew collapsed. Behind the icon wasn't math. It was a vault, a hidden life, messages, photos, threads of conversations stretching back months, maybe years. A secret world she had been building while I cooked dinners, packed lunches, held children who whispered for their mother. 9 names stared back at me from the top of the chat list, like indictments lined in bold. Ryan, Matt, Cole, 2 saved only by initials, and then Jace, the one adorned with heart emojis, the one labeled my escape. Some of the men were half her age, barely in their 20s, writing words no married woman should receive. She didn't just reply. She sent pieces of herself, photos cropped carefully, always enough to entice, never enough to reveal her whole face. But I recognized her hands, her hair, the marks on her body I had kissed 100 times. She gave strangers what she claimed I had made ordinary. I scrolled until my eyes blurred. Ryan begged to see her again. A stranger asked if she could sneak away after her shift. She promised she would, and Jace told her she deserved better than a man who dragged her down. She wrote back that she believed him. The cruelty wasn't only in the sexual texts or the photos, it was in the intimacy. The confessions once meant for me now scattered like broken glass in another man's hands. She told Jace she hated how boring I was, how I never surprised her. She told him she imagined running away. She even wrote love once, the same word she rationed with me, claiming she hated hearing it too often. 9 names, but one towered above the rest. Jace, he wasn't content with flirting. He offered her identity, a role where she was radiant, misunderstood, trapped in a house with a husband too small for her dreams. He didn't just seduce her body, he seduced her story. My chest tightened as I read, not because I was shocked, but because everything now fit too perfectly. The perfume, the tilted phone, the mocking laughter during arguments, they weren't accidents, they were symptoms, signs of a second life I had been too blind or too loyal to confront. I sat there in the dark, the blue glow painting betrayal across my face. Clarity settled over me, heavier than rage. Rage destroys quickly, but this clarity lingered, cold and permanent. The marriage I thought I was saving had already been burned to the ground, message by message, picture by picture. When she came home humming, hanging her coat like nothing had happened, I saw her differently. She leaned down to kiss me with lips that had just whispered promises to other men. I let her, the vault in my pocket buzzed with secrets, 9 names pressing against me like ghosts waiting to testify. I didn't shout, I didn't demand explanations. I simply watched her, a stranger in my own home, and realized the truth with terrifying calm. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was her alibi, a cover story. A last name her children could still trust while she lived another life just beyond the reach of our walls. And as I sat there, the weight of 9 names heavy in my chest, I understood something final. Betrayal doesn't announce itself with thunder. It seeps in, one secret at a time, until all that remains is the silence before a storm that has already begun. The morning of our son's 8th birthday should have been simple joy, a day stitched with balloons, frosting, and laughter echoing through the walls. I woke early, blowing up balloons until my lungs ached, taping them crookedly to the corners of the living room. The cake waited in the fridge, chocolate layered and frosted with clumsy care, candles lined like small soldiers ready for his wish. The children tumbled out of bed with the kind of energy only birthdays can summon, costumes slipping off shoulders, voices bright with anticipation. Marissa, though, was absent. She had left before dawn, her apron still in the car, saying she had been called for an extra shift. She kissed Zoe's hair, promised she would be back before dinner, and disappeared into a day that should have been sacred. I wanted to believe her. 6 kids were noise enough without suspicion weighing every moment, so I became a one-man parade. I wrapped gifts, refereed games, lit candles. I filmed the chaos, sending her short clips, our son's cheeks puffing before he blew out candles, the chorus of Happy Birthday rising off-key but perfect. I texted her, "Look at him, he wished for a puppy." No reply came back. Hours stretched, shadows lengthened, and every time the front door stayed closed, the weight inside me grew heavier. By evening, the candles were smoke curling in the kitchen, the cake sliced unevenly, frosting smeared across cheeks sticky with sugar. The kids asked, "When will Mom be home?" I lied gently, saying traffic was bad, shifts run long. I tucked them into bed with the kind of smile that hides a crack. It was close to midnight when the door finally opened. Marissa swept in, hair hastily pulled back, apron hanging loose as if she had just left the shop. She hugged the birthday boy quickly, too quickly, her smile brittle. Then she collapsed on the couch with a sigh. "Brutal day at work," she muttered, already reaching for her phone. I studied her from across the room. Her eyes weren't tired, they were elsewhere, glowing with a satisfaction that had nothing to do with lattes or spilled milk at the cafe. Something inside me sank, not with shock, but with recognition. The vault in my pocket whispered what I already knew. 2 days later, while sorting receipts for the fragile budget that barely held us, I found one folded in her coat pocket. A drugstore purchase, time-stamped the very afternoon of our son's birthday. Plan B. My throat closed. I traced the numbers, checked her location history. She hadn't been near the shop at all. She had driven across town near the apartment complex where Jace lived. The timeline was merciless. The moment I sent her a video of our son blowing out candles, she was lying in another man's bed, already planning to erase the evidence of what they had done. The cruelty wasn't only in the act, it was in its timing. Birthdays are supposed to anchor children, proof that their family is whole, that their parents are present. Instead, my son will always remember a cake cut without his mother, videos she never answered, a day marked by absence rather than love. That night, I didn't confront her. She scrolled her phone with the same guarded smile, laughing softly at words I couldn't see. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. Love didn't break like glass. It calcified, hardened into something heavier than rage, not anger, disgust. Because you can forgive weakness. You can fight against drifting apart. But abandoning your child's birthday to another man's bed, that is not weakness. That is a choice, a deliberate cruelty that poisons everything it touches. I tucked the receipt into my folder of evidence, the one growing thicker each week. I watched her smile at her glowing screen, and I understood. The marriage was no longer something to rescue. It was something to remember, to record, to bury when the time came. And as I sat in that kitchen, the house finally quiet, the ghosts of balloons drifting in the corners, I realized a new truth. You don't rescue someone who chooses to vanish from her own child's celebration. You simply wait. Wait for the day the truth no longer needs to be shouted because it will stand on its own, undeniable. The birthday had been meant for joy. Instead, it became the day I stopped being her husband in my heart. The day I stopped hoping. The day the betrayal was no longer private. It was written into the memory of our children, carved into the candles that burned without her. The first time she threw something at me, it was almost absurd. An Xbox controller arcing through the air, plastic cracking against the wall before ricocheting off and clipping the back of my head. I remember the sharp gasp of the children standing in the doorway, their eyes wide, waiting to see if I would explode. I didn't. I picked up the controller, placed it gently on the table, and told them to go upstairs. That was the night I realized her rage wasn't random. It was a performance. When words failed to twist the truth, she turned to objects. A bag of cat food once, torn open in a fury, pellets exploding across the kitchen tiles like shrapnel. Another time, the slow cooker again, cord whipping like a tail before it smashed into the drywall, leaving a crater I could never fully patch. Each act was chaos with choreography. She never swung where it would leave marks on her body, only on the walls, the furniture, the space between us. The damage was visible enough to stage a story, but not enough to betray the truth she wanted to sell. Her voice was its own weapon. "You're destroying me," she screamed, lunging forward, eyes wild, daring me to push her back. When I raised my arms to shield myself, she cried louder, "Don't touch me, don't touch me." The words weren't for me. They were for the jury she imagined, neighbors through thin walls, children lingering in hallways, anyone who might one day ask what happened inside this house. She rehearsed her defense night after night, planting lines like seeds. Once she dragged a knife into the scene, pressing the blade to her chest, threatening to end it all if I walked away. The children wailed in the doorway, their little hands shaking. I stood frozen, not because I believed she would do it, but because I knew what she wanted. for me to beg, to plead, to play the role of desperate husband in her drama. I refused. Instead, I began documenting. Quiet photos of the holes in the wall, screenshots of her messages where she admitted to losing it. Notes on the dates, the times, the context. My folders grew thicker while her act grew louder. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage where every night she tested new lines, new props, new ways to push me toward an outburst. If she screamed abuse loud enough, maybe one day someone would believe her. If she threw enough objects, maybe I would snap and finally validate her script. But I didn't. I stood still. I cleaned up. I waited. That didn't mean it didn't hurt. Each object shattered something more than glass. Each scream chipped away at the memory of who she once was. I no longer saw the woman I had married. I saw an actress who believed chaos could be her ticket to control, her starring role in a tragedy she was writing for us all. And the children, they were her unwilling audience. I watched them cover their ears with tiny hands, watched their eyes flinch at every crack of impact. I saw my son's lip tremble when she screamed accusations at me loud enough for him to hear. I saw Zoe clutch her siblings and whisper that it would be okay when she knew it wasn't. It was in those moments, surrounded by cracked drywall and the sound of my children's muffled sobs, that I realized something devastating. This marriage was no longer about love or betrayal or even infidelity. It was about survival. Every object she hurled, every false accusation she rehearsed, every scream meant for an invisible jury reminded me that the walls of our house were not walls at all. They were curtains. Curtains pulled tight around a stage where I had become her unwilling co-star. And standing there in the spotlight of her rage, I chose silence, not weakness, not surrender. Silence as shield, silence as survival, because one day the audience she had been rehearsing for would finally arrive. And when they did, I wanted them to see clearly which of us had been performing. It was late, the kind of late when the house is wrapped in children's sleep, when even the hum of the refrigerator feels like a warning. Marissa and I had been circling the same arguments for days. Her midnight shifts, her hidden phone, the holes in the drywall that told stories she would never admit. That night the air was heavy, every breath a negotiation. She paced the kitchen in sharp lines, her eyes locked on me like an opponent measuring the distance to strike. I stayed silent. My father had taught me silence could be stronger than fury, but with Marissa, silence was like fuel. It enraged her more than shouting ever could. "You think you're untouchable," she hissed, her finger stabbing toward my chest. Her voice rose, shaking the cabinets. "Let's see what the cops think." Before I could move, she grabbed her phone and dialed. The calm, almost bored voice of the 911 operator echoed from the speaker as she launched into her performance. "My husband is scaring me. I don't feel safe. Please, someone has to come." She added a sob for effect, wiping dry eyes with the back of her wrist like a seasoned actress. When she hung up, her smirk returned. She folded her arms across her chest, queen-like satisfied. "Now you'll learn," she said, certain that the script she had rehearsed for years would finally have an audience. Minutes later, red and blue lights painted the children's bedroom walls. They woke to flashing chaos, whispering my name in fear. Tiny feet shuffled into the hallway, pajamas wrinkled, eyes wide and glistening. My youngest clutched a stuffed bear so tightly I thought the seams might tear. 2 officers entered. One asked me calmly to step aside, while the other turned to Marissa, guiding her gently as if she were fragile glass. And she began again, her trembling voice, her wide eyes, her story polished smooth. I was angry. I was controlling. I was dangerous. For a heartbeat, I wondered if it would work, if the years of rehearsals would finally pay off, if the walls, dented and cracked by her own hands, would now be counted as mine. But the officers weren't blind. One scanned the room, eyes landing on the controller, denting the drywall, on the scattered objects, on the bruises darkening my forearms where I had blocked her throws. They asked quiet questions, the kind she hadn't practiced answers for. Who threw the object? Why were the kids awake? Why did her version shift with each sentence? Her confidence faltered. Smirk melted into protest. "He's lying, he's twisting everything." She shouted, too loud, too wild for the fragile victim she tried to play, and then came the words that changed everything. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." The handcuffs clicked, metal against bone. The children gasped as they watched their mother pulled toward the door. She thrashed, screaming at them, screaming at me, trying to claw back the narrative slipping through her fingers. "You don't understand. He's the abuser." One officer shook his head. "Not tonight." For years, I had been the silent witness, the man sweeping up broken pieces while she rehearsed her defense. Now in the blaze of red and blue, the state itself became my witness. Her theater ended. The curtain dropped. Cold steel and public record replaced her performance, but I didn't cheer. I didn't breathe relief. I looked at my children, wide-eyed, trembling in the hallway, and I knew this wasn't victory. This was survival, carved into a police report. As they led her outside, her voice cracked, half curse, half plea. "Ethan," she screamed, "you'll regret this." I didn't answer. For the first time, silence wasn't a shield, it was proof. Proof that the story she had tried to script for years had finally unraveled in front of the only audience that mattered. And in that silence, a new thought settled like stone in my chest. This was the beginning of her downfall, not because I demanded it, but because the truth, at last, had a stage she couldn't control. It was a Tuesday afternoon, one of those deceptively quiet days when the air hums with an uneasy stillness. The children were upstairs, arguing faintly over toys, while the dryer rattled in the corner like a tired drum. I was folding laundry, the rhythm of ordinary life carrying me for a moment. Then my hand brushed against something solid hidden in the folds of her jeans. At first, I thought it was her wallet, but when I pulled it free, my pulse faltered. A phone. Sleek, black, caseless, not the one she carried everywhere like an extension of her hand. I stared at it, my breath stuck in my throat. Curiosity waged war against dread. Finally, I pressed the power button. The screen lit, new wallpaper, a different number, a second life. The lock code was almost mocking in its simplicity, her birthday again. The screen opened easily, as though she never believed I'd have the courage to look. And then the truth poured out, harsher than anything I had braced myself for. Messages, hundreds of them. Explicit photos, hers and Jace's, traded like currency, promises that dripped with lust. Rendezvous scheduled during hours I thought she was working overtime. Every scroll deepened the wound, but I couldn't stop. Then came something darker. Between the sexts and the selfies, I found screenshots of gift cards, hundreds of dollars each, transaction receipts, wire transfers. "Babe, can you grab me another $200? Jace wrote, "It'll help us get a place together." And there it was, her reply, codes sent back with heart emojis, her trust as transactional as the love she thought she'd found. A chill ran through me. This wasn't romance, it was exploitation. Jace wasn't a lover, he was a con artist, using affection as bait, siphoning money from a family already drowning. She hadn't only betrayed me, she had gambled away our children's security for a fantasy. The fury came first, quick and white-hot. How could she? How could she trade loyalty for this pathetic illusion? But beneath the anger, another feeling rose, colder and sharper, grim satisfaction. Because the man she'd chosen over me wasn't better, wasn't braver, wasn't more alive. He was a bottom-feeding scammer, a parasite. She mocked me as boring, insufficient, unworthy. Yet the man she gave everything to saw her as nothing more than a wallet and a willing body. I sat at the table staring at the phone, my fingers cold. Rage wanted me to confront her immediately, to scream until the walls cracked. But clarity told me to wait. Some truths burn hotter when you let them sit, when you allow betrayal to ripen into undeniable evidence. That evening she came home, tossing her apron on the counter, sighing about customers from hell. She looked at me with the same guarded smile, the same performance she'd been perfecting for months. Did she know I'd found it? Could she sense the weight of the phone in my pocket? She carried herself like she was still winning, still clever enough to juggle both lives without consequence. I said nothing. I simply studied her, memorizing her face the way one studies a stranger on a train, curious, detached, almost pitying. She thought she was carrying a grand, secret romance. I knew she was just another name in a conman's ledger. Later, when the house was quiet, I placed the burner phone in a drawer, sliding it shut like sealing a coffin. I didn't need to wave it in her face yet. I needed it intact. I needed it whole. Because someday in court or in custody battles, this would be more than a weapon. It would be the truth, undeniable and devastating. And as I lay in bed that night, her perfume still clinging faintly to the pillow between us, I understood something brutal. She believed she was free. She believed she was loved. But in reality, she was shackled to a scammer, chained by her own delusion. The second phone hadn't just exposed infidelity. It had stripped her illusions bare. It showed me what she had chosen over us. And it gave me something I hadn't had in years: leverage. The night I confronted Marissa with the burner phone, she didn't look shocked. She laughed. That hollow, mocking laugh she had perfected, the one that made me feel like a paranoid fool. I set the phone on the table, screen unlocked, the messages between her and Jace glowing like open wounds. "This," I said quietly, "isn't stress. This is betrayal." She opened her mouth to reply, but her real phone buzzed on the counter. She lunged for it instinctively, eyes darting to the screen. I leaned forward just in time to catch the name before she could flip it over. Darren. For a second, her mask cracked. Panic flickered in her eyes, not indifference. "He's just reaching out," she stammered. "It's nothing. I haven't spoken to him in years." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Later, when the kids were asleep and the house was still, I started digging. Old emails, archived social media posts, photos I hadn't looked at in years. Each discovery was a pin pushed into a map I hadn't realized existed. Darren wasn't just an old boyfriend. He overlapped with me. Dates lined up too neatly. Messages from study weekends and visits to her sister matched perfectly with his travel posts. Places she swore she'd been alone appeared in the background of his pictures. The realization hit harder than Jace's betrayal. Jace was current, raw, humiliating. But Darren revealed something far deeper. Infidelity hadn't begun with the late-night perfume or the tilted phone screen. It had been there from the start, woven into the foundation of what I thought was our love story. I sat in the dark with the burner phone in one hand and Darren's message glowing on the other, and I realized something crueler than betrayal itself. I had never been unique. She had been rehearsing affairs long before Jace, long before vows, long before she ever called me home. Memories I once clung to now unraveled. The weekends she claimed to need space. The silences she explained as exhaustion. The late nights framed as study groups or overtime. They weren't gaps in our timeline. They were overlaps, echoes of another life she had been living while I waited faithfully. I thought of our wedding day, the vows she recited with steady eyes, the promises I had replayed whenever I doubted. Now those words rang hollow, lines delivered by an actress already auditioning for other roles. I felt my stomach twist as the scope of it spread. This wasn't a single betrayal. It was a pattern. A cycle, a choice she made again and again with different names, different faces, different excuses. Each man another layer of deceit, another edit in the story she let me believe was ours. And beneath the devastation, something inside me hardened. Because if Jace showed me the marriage I thought I had was already dead, Darren showed me it might never have been alive in the first place. I closed my eyes and saw her as she had been years ago. Laughing, radiant, the woman I believed had chosen me out of everyone else. Now I understood. I had never been the only one. I had been the convenient one, the steady one, the man who kept the roof from collapsing while she entertained storms outside it. That night I sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the burner phone and Darren's message side by side like twin gravestones. One marked the death of the present, the other marked the death of the past. The house was silent, but I could hear the echoes, her laughter, her excuses, the false warmth of nights she returned to me after being with someone else. They weren't memories anymore. They were hauntings, and they left me with a truth I could no longer ignore. Marissa's betrayal wasn't a single act. It was a lifetime audition, and I had been nothing more than the stage she performed on. After Darren's message, after the burner phone, after months of digging through shadows that confirmed every suspicion, I clung to one fragile thread. Zoe, my eldest, my first. The child who had arrived 2 weeks early, who spoke in sentences before other children strung 2 words together, who anchored me in a season when grief for my father might have drowned me. She had been my proof that something good had come from all the chaos. But patterns don't lie, and neither do timelines. Darren's overlap fell too close to the months before Zoe's conception. The thought clawed up from the pit I tried to bury it in. What if she wasn't mine? What if the one relationship I thought unbreakable had been forged on a lie? I ordered the kit online, hands shaking as I typed. It felt clinical, detached, just another test, another line item in a case file. But this wasn't evidence. This was my soul. One afternoon, while Zoe laughed at a cartoon, I swabbed her cheek gently, pretending it was a silly game. She giggled, unaware that her father's heart was breaking with every soft circle of cotton. I sealed the sample, mailed it away, and waited. Waiting was its own torture. Days stretched, each hour a stone in my chest. I carried on as though nothing had changed, packing lunches, tying shoelaces, reading bedtime stories. But inside, a clock ticked mercilessly, counting down to an answer I both needed and feared. When the envelope arrived, I opened it alone. No children, no noise, just me, the paper, and a truth heavy enough to fracture the floor. Probability of paternity, 0%. The words blurred as I read them again and again, hoping the numbers would shift, hoping ink could bend under desperation. But they didn't. Blood had spoken. Zoe, the girl who once gripped my finger with her tiny hand, who called me Dad before she could say her own name, was not mine. For a long time, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt hollowed out. The memories came rushing in, cruel in their clarity. Nights I rocked her through fevers. Mornings she barreled into bed, whispering secrets only we shared. The way she mirrored my expressions as though we had a private language. None of it was erased by blood, but all of it was poisoned by the knowledge that Marissa had lied at the most sacred level. I dropped the paper on the table and stared at the ceiling until my eyes burned. A paradox tore me apart. No test could measure the bond I had lived, the years of devotion, the love that had grown without hesitation. And yet the test screamed that the bond was counterfeit, that my fatherhood had been a story written on fraud. I thought of Zoe's laugh, of how she had saved me without ever knowing it. And now she became the cruelest twist of all, both salvation and betrayal bound together in a single child. The devastation was total. But beneath it, clarity sharpened like a blade. Marissa hadn't only betrayed me with other men. She had built a family on deception. She had handed me children wrapped in lies, daring me to raise them as my own while she whispered love to strangers. Legally, the result gave me leverage. Grounds for annulment, custody battles tilted in my favor. But practically, it hollowed me out. Because what court papers can never measure is the weight of a child's trust and how betrayal poisons even that. I swore to myself, through the ache, that I would never treat Zoe differently. She was innocent, a child born into deceit not of her making. She deserved love, stability, and the father she believed I was. But inside, a wound bled endlessly. Because every time I looked at her, I saw not only the daughter who had lifted me from despair. I saw proof that the life I thought I lived had been counterfeit from the start. DNA doesn't lie, but neither does love. And now I was caught in between, carrying a truth too cruel to speak aloud. For weeks, Jace had been the shadow in every corner of our marriage. His name glowed in her hidden apps, whispered through midnight texts, penciled into gaps in our calendar. To her, he was the escape, the man who made her feel radiant, desired, alive. To me, he was the faceless thief who had stolen the last remnants of my trust. But the truth didn't arrive in confrontation. It came through carelessness, hers and his. Tucked inside the burner phone's gallery were screenshots of receipts, digital gift cards, hundreds of dollars at a time. I followed the trail, cross-referencing with online fraud reports, and the name behind it all surfaced, not Jace, not the romantic savior she painted him to be. His real name was Joe. He wasn't a soulmate. He wasn't a better partner. He was a con artist. The chat logs made it clear she wasn't his only angel. His rehearsed lines echoed across multiple conversations with other women. Copy and paste declarations of love, promises of futures, pet names recycled like cheap props. The same words Marissa clung to, the same lines that made her believe she was unique, had been sent to strangers across the country. I scrolled, numb, watching the illusion unravel. The photos she had sent, angles meant to entice, poses designed to seduce, were not evidence of love. They were transactions in a scam. She hadn't chosen passion over me, she had chosen delusion. The cruelest line came from one of his replies. She had written about leaving me, about running away to start a new life together. His response was short, transactional. Cool. Can you grab another $200 first? That was love in her world. That was what she gambled our children's stability for, a fraudster with his hand out. A man who saw her not as radiant or irreplaceable, but as disposable, a name in a ledger, a wallet that bled. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen until the glow blurred. Anger pulsed in me, yes, but it was different now. Less fire, more ice. Because rage assumes the other person holds power. But in that moment, I saw the truth. Marissa wasn't powerful. She was pathetic. She had risked everything, her marriage, her children's security, her reputation, her own dignity. And for what? For a recycled script typed out by a conman who was probably laughing as he copied the same words into 3 other conversations. That night when she walked through the door humming off-key, tossing her apron on the counter, I studied her like a stranger in a waiting room. She thought she carried a secret, thought she was clever enough to juggle 2 lives. But I knew, and worse, I pitied her. The betrayal no longer cut sharp. It sagged under its own weight because she hadn't chosen someone better than me. She hadn't chosen a man who saw her worth. She had chosen to be used. I thought back to every insult she hurled, boring, useless, pathetic. She had thrown those words at me like knives. Yet the man she chose reduced her to something even smaller. Not a wife, not a lover, not even a partner. Just a mark. For years, she mocked me for my stability, for my routines, for being the man who packed lunches and paid bills. And yet the better man she threw it all away for didn't bring her flowers or a future. He brought her fraud, and he charged interest. In that twisted irony, I felt something I hadn't in months, control. Because I finally saw the truth behind the mask she had clung to. And the truth was this: she hadn't left me for love, she had left me for a lie. The courthouse smelled of polish and paper, a place where lives are reduced to folders stacked higher than hope. I walked in carrying one of my own, a folder thick as a dictionary, packed with photos of holes in drywall, screenshots of hidden messages, receipts that traced her money to Joe's scams. I told myself the truth was heavy enough to tilt the scales. Marissa arrived dressed in soft colors, pale sweater, hair tied back, eyes rimmed with careful sorrow. She had 2 of her friends with her, women from the coffee shop who had whispered encouragement into her ear for months, women who had covered for her shifts when she disappeared into another man's apartment. They flanked her like guardians of a saint, nodding and clutching tissues before a single tear had even fallen. The courtroom leaned toward her. I could see it in the way the bailiff softened as she dabbed at her eyes. In the way the judge tilted forward, sympathy already brimming. She didn't walk in as an adulterer or a liar. She walked in as the wounded, and people always want to believe the wounded. Her story unfolded like theater. She spoke of fear, of a husband who was controlling, of nights spent trembling in her own home. Every hole in the wall became my rage. Every bruise she had ever mentioned, real or imagined, became mine. Even my evidence was twisted into obsession. Why else would he track my receipts unless he was stalking me? Why else would he take photos unless he wanted to control me? Her friends nodded along, voices quivering as they added their embellishments. They hadn't been there, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they sounded convincing. The courtroom became a stage, and Marissa played her role flawlessly. When my turn came, I laid out the evidence. Dates, times, screenshots, photos of my forearms bruised from blocking her throws, records of money drained from our accounts into Joe's schemes. I spoke steadily, but as I did, I saw the glaze settle in the judge's eyes. Facts were neat, but they lacked the raw pull of her trembling voice. They lacked the theater of her tear falling at just the right moment. The verdict came like a blow. Her restraining order was upheld. Worse, one of her enablers was granted a protection order against me as well. In the eyes of the court, I wasn't the man protecting children and patching walls. I was the harasser, the bitter ex-husband trying to ruin lives out of spite. I stood there, folder heavy in my arms, and realized the truth. In that room, facts didn't matter. Narrative did, and she had written the better one. Walking out of the courthouse, humiliation clung to me like smoke. But beneath it, clarity hardened. Justice is not guaranteed, not in a system where sympathy outweighs evidence, where performance drowns out proof. If Marissa's weapon was drama, mine could no longer be hope. It had to be patience, strategy, discipline. It wasn't her victory, not really. Protection orders couldn't erase the receipts. They couldn't undo the DNA test. They couldn't unmask Joe as anything other than a fraud. All those truths still stood, waiting for their stage. But it was a lesson carved deep into my pride. Righteousness alone was not enough. If I wanted to survive her chaos, I had to stop playing defense. I had to learn the rules of her theater and then write my own script, one she couldn't rewrite with tears or trembling hands. As I stepped into the sunlight outside, folder still heavy in my hands, I felt no relief, only resolve. Marissa had won the day with performance, but the story wasn't finished, and I would not let her be the author of its ending. After the humiliation of the courtroom, something inside me broke, but not in the way Marissa intended. I stopped thinking of myself as a husband fighting for reconciliation or even a man defending his dignity. From that moment, I treated everything like a war, and wars are not won with rage. They are won with patience, with endurance, with proof. So I began to record everything. Each morning, I logged the hour I woke the kids, the exact time breakfast was served, the moment backpacks were zipped and lined by the door. Doctor's appointments, homework assignments, baths drawn at night. I wrote it all down. The ordinary became ammunition. Where Marissa cloaked her failures in chaos, I built my defense in order. My office turned into a bunker. Binders stacked high, each one tabbed and dated, each photo placed carefully into its sleeve. Police reports, copies of protective orders, every venomous text she sent, preserved. Financial statements marked with the gift cards she drained into Joe's scams. Call logs downloaded, printed until the cartridges groaned. The mountain grew taller with each day, and with it my resolve. I wasn't waiting for her next move. I was preparing for it. It didn't take long. One gray afternoon, there was a knock on my door. 2 agents from Child Protective Services stood on my porch, faces stern, clipboards in hand. They had received an anonymous report. Neglect, screaming, children left hungry. I didn't need to ask who filed it. Marissa had found a new weapon, but she hadn't counted on my preparation. I invited them in, sat them at the kitchen table, and laid my binders before them. Pages of balanced meals photographed and dated. Receipts from pediatric visits. Report cards signed by teachers who praised my involvement. Even videos of us baking cookies. Flour dusting our noses, children's laughter spilling louder than any accusation. The agents flipped through the evidence, suspicions softening into something else, respect. When they left, one of them paused at the door. "Most people scramble when we arrive," she said quietly. "You seem prepared." Prepared, that word settled in my chest like a small victory. Marissa's lies collapsed under the weight of my records. Each false report she filed became another brick in the wall I built against her. Each accusation only proved how far she was willing to sink while I stood steady. Her credibility frayed thread by thread. For the first time in years, I felt the balance of power shift. Not because I shouted louder, not because I fought dirtier, but because I had finally understood the truth. In her world of theater, performance mattered more than fact. But in the quiet halls of agencies and courts, order triumphed. Documentation triumphed. Discipline triumphed. This wasn't glamorous revenge. There was no cinematic confrontation, no moment of triumph scored with applause. My revenge was slower, sharper. It was discipline written in ink and timestamps, in 100 small notes that would one day close the coffin on her narrative. And as I closed another binder that night, sliding it onto the shelf beside the others, I felt something almost foreign. Control. For the first time in years, I wasn't simply reacting to her chaos. I was shaping the ground beneath us. I wasn't her defendant anymore. I was the author of my own countermove. The envelope came on a Wednesday afternoon, tucked between bills and glossy advertisements I didn't remember ordering. My name was written on the front in her handwriting, slanted, familiar, almost gentle. For a long moment, I just stood on the porch staring at it, the county jail's stamp in the corner pressing reality against my chest. It had been months since I had heard her voice without the filter of lawyers or the static of courtroom microphones. And now here she was, reaching me in ink. I carried it inside, set it on the table, and let it sit while the house hummed around me. Opening it felt like opening a wound. Eventually, I unfolded the pages. They smelled faintly of disinfectant, of desperation. The sentences tumbled unevenly, loops and slants like she had written them in a rush between head counts. Ethan, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt you, but you don't understand how alone I felt. I loved you. I still love you, but you never listened. You pushed me away. Jace was just a distraction. You were my home. Please, please don't give up on me. The kids need us together. I need you. I am nothing without you. I read it once, then again, my eyes catching on the contradictions. Every apology was shadowed with accusation. Every confession tangled with blame. One sentence begged forgiveness. The next demanded responsibility from me. If you had paid more attention, if you hadn't been so cold, if you had made me feel like enough. For years, I had answered these words when they came in screams, in sobs, in venom disguised as need. I had explained, defended, bargained, pleaded. Each time I believed if I just said the right thing, if I just loved harder, if I just endured longer, maybe the cycle would break. But this time, I didn't reach for a pen. I slid the pages back into the envelope and set it on the counter. I didn't respond. I didn't react. Silence has its own weight, heavier than anger, sharper than insult. In not replying, I gave her something she had never faced from me before, absence. No counterargument to twist, no defense to mock, no voice to drown out. Just a void. That evening, Zoe sat at the table with her math homework spread out like puzzle pieces. I leaned over, guiding her through the steps, our heads bent close together. The envelope lay beside us, unopened now, irrelevant. When the kids asked who it was from, I said simply, no one important. And for the first time, I meant it. Because the truth was clear, her words weren't a lifeline. They were driftwood, pieces of wreckage from a ship already sunk. Once I would have clung to them, desperate not to drown. Now I let them float past. That night I watched the kids laugh at a cartoon, their voices filling the spaces her chaos once occupied. And I understood something I had fought against for years. My silence wasn't cruelty. It wasn't revenge. It was freedom. By not replying, I ended the conversation she had been scripting for more than a decade. I wasn't the other character in her drama anymore. I wasn't her audience, her foil, her mirror. I was simply done. And in that silence, I found the first real peace I had felt in years. The legal tide had shifted. With DNA results in my hand and months of records stacked like bricks around me, annulment was no longer a gamble but a certainty. Custody leaned my way too. Every binder I built turned her chaos into my credibility. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like survival was borrowed air. But freedom doesn't come as a single moment. It arrives in fragments, papers signed, nights quiet, mornings where no one shouts. My fragments came through Amber. She had been there through the worst, watching the kids, calming their tears, helping me patch the holes in walls and in myself. One evening, after the children were tucked in, she sat across from me at the table, her expression heavy with the kind of secret that eats at you if you hold it too long. "There's something you should know," she said softly. It wasn't just Marissa, her twin and the shop manager. They covered for her. They encouraged it. They groomed her into this spiral. The words landed like both revelation and inevitability. Of course, Marissa hadn't done it alone. Of course, someone had whispered excuses into her ear, provided the cover stories, blurred the lines between work and betrayal. Her twin had played her part, slipping lies into family conversations. The manager had funded her escapes, even paying for the burner phone. Together, they built the stage on which Marissa performed her collapse. I could have destroyed them. I had the names, the receipts, the timeline. I could have dragged all of them into the fire, exposed them until their lives crumbled too. For a moment, the thought tempted me. Revenge had been the fuel that carried me this far. Why stop now when I could burn everything connected to her? But then I looked at Amber, at the kids sleeping upstairs, at the stacks of binders that already told the story of a war I hadn't chosen but had endured. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to believe before. I didn't need to. My revenge wasn't in dragging her further down. It wasn't in exposing her twin or humiliating her manager. It was in building a life where Marissa was irrelevant. My victory wasn't her destruction, it was my freedom. So I chose silence over spectacle, distance over destruction, freedom over fire. One afternoon, I gathered everything into a metal pan in the backyard. The letter from jail, the DNA results, copies of messages I no longer needed to reread. I struck a match and watched as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. Smoke rose into the sky, carried by a breeze that smelled faintly of grass and summer. Inside the house, my children laughed, their voices light, untouched by the weight I had carried for so long. For years, my nights had been filled with shouting, with accusations, with rehearsed performances of abuse and chaos. Now the soundtrack of my life was their laughter, and it was enough. As the last ember dimmed, I understood. The ashes of betrayal weren't just remnants of what I lost. They were the soil for what I could build, a quieter home, a steadier life, a future no longer chained to her lies. I didn't let her go with rage. I didn't let her go with pity. I let her go with indifference. She was no longer the storm in my life. She was just a past tense, a ghost burned away with the papers in that pan. And as I stood in the fading light, smoke dissolving into the evening sky, I realized that freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it exhales. Sometimes it feels like silence after years of noise. That was my revenge. That was my freedom. And so the story of she cheated, she went to jail, now my ex-wife cries for my forgiveness comes to a close. What began as betrayal ended as survival, and the price of infidelity was more than she ever imagined. But here's the question for you. If you were in his shoes, would you forgive her, or would you walk away forever? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Remember, betrayal always carries a cost. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Until next time, stay strong and stay true to yourself.